The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. And in the process of that realization, there is so much positive potential. Let me tell you about a story that goes all the way back into Pali and Sanskrit, which were the first languages that the Buddha teachings were put out in. Originally, of course, they were oral teachings before there was written language. And then they were passed down through regular recitations. As you probably know, after the Buddha died, there was a congregation of the senior disciples of the Buddha, and they had his attendant and cousin, who supposedly had a photographic memory, or I'm not sure photographic is the right term because it was auditory. He could remember anything that was said. And in the 30 years that he served the Buddha as his attendant, he heard everything the Buddha said, basically, except possibly private conversations. And the elders in the group asked him to repeat everything that the Buddha said. This is why all the Buddha sutras begin with the words, "Thus have I heard." And so he did. And this was carried down. And in fact, when we were living in Mandalay, in Myanmar, back in the 1960s, every year there was an annual get-together of Buddhist monks from all over Burma, Myanmar, at a particular place, not very far away from our house, in which they took turns reciting the sutras. It was kind of a contest, but it was also an event that allowed the oral memory to continue down the generations. Many countries, there has been the tradition of the troubadour who sang songs that would tell the history of the country or the event or the locale. And in some countries, this continues to the day. I don't know if the Buddhist recitation of the sutras, the annual recitation of the sutras, continues in Myanmar. Of course, Myanmar is filled now with violence, grief, anguish, pain, and suffering, as is so much of the world. It's now considered that there are now two COVID experiences. There are the experiences of the wealthy countries who've been able to vaccinate a sufficient number of their people, that the whole rate of incidence of COVID infections and deaths has been diminishing. And there are others where they have not been able to find the resources or get to the sources of vaccinations. And so the COVID is raging in these countries, Africa, Latin America, and other parts of the world. We have the violent storms that are seem to be caused by global warming, or enhanced by global warming is perhaps a better word. We have untold misery, untold violence, wars. We have people who are carrying the residue of war in the form of PTSD, many of whom have committed suicide. In fact, more veterans have committed suicide through the anguish of trying to deal with PTSD, the symptoms of post-traumatic stress, the symptoms of all they went through, physical, mental, emotional, moral injuries, then I believe it exceeds the number of people that died in all the wars. It's not a good situation. In Buddhism, it is taught, and as we go deeply enough in our practice, we begin to realize that all beings are worthy, that for some people, life experiences have caused so much suffering that they in turn cause suffering to others. There's plenty of this in the news. But underneath it all, there is this innate perfection that we can open to and recognize and live from, which is the most important part. This is why Hakuin and his student Torei, his successor Torei Enji, emphasized the need for advanced practice and the long maturation being as we open more and more completely to awareness. It includes awareness of where we have not behaved exemplary. And that is a point in time when many people choose to quit practice. They don't want to see it. They feel like Buddhism is making them a worse person, when actually what it is doing is shining the light on our behavior in such a way that we can see it so much more clearly and recognize that we weren't behaving in the best way, in the way that was least causing suffering to ourselves and to others. And so it's important, it's vital as part of our practice to continue walking bravely into these moments when we see clearly our own behavior, to feel it, to own it, to offer it radical acceptance. If it is appropriate, the circumstances allow for it, to make amends and to vow not to continue that behavior in the future. So I started to talk about this story that was very, very, very early story in Buddhism, supposedly from the Buddha's time. And it was, as I said, originally recorded in Sanskrit and Pali, the first written languages that the Buddhist teachings were recorded in. And it is about a man who became known as Angulimala. Angulimala literally translates to necklace of fingers. And he got that name because for some reason, he was compelled to collect people's fingers. And in order to collect people's fingers, he had to, since most people are not willingly letting go of their fingers, he had to chop them off. I think it was one finger per person. And of course, people would resist. And so he became known as a murderer. And it got so extreme, supposedly, that the king of the area launched an army to hunt him down and probably to kill him, so that he stops doing this horrid practice. In the early texts, it only says that Angulimala had this predilection for attacking people and chopping off their little finger, and then he'd string it around his neck as a part of a necklace. And he was interested in or compelled to collect 1,000 of these fingers. He had reached 999 when he saw the Buddha walking on a path nearby. And he thought, aha, here's my 1,000th finger. But something bizarre happened. The Buddha was quietly walking peacefully on that path. And somehow Angulimala, despite the fact he was much younger and stronger and quite fit, somehow couldn't catch up with him. It was a bizarre experience. And it is reminiscent in a way of when the monk Myo, the former general who was pursuing the sixth patriarch, assuming that he had stolen the robe and the bowl from the fifth patriarch, and had caught up with him, and Eno had recognized that he was about to be accosted and had set the robe and the bowl on a rock and gone behind a bush. And when monk Myo encountered the robe and the bowl, he tried to lift it up and take it away, and he couldn't lift it. It's interesting, these events. At any rate, finally, Angulimala calls out, "Stop, stop." And the Buddha turns quietly, looking at him clearly and with no malice, no anger, says, "I have stopped. I've stopped killing. Now it's time for you to stop killing." And there was something about the Buddha's demeanor that caused Angulimala to throw down his weapons, follow the Buddha back to where he was living, and become a monk. And this is held up as an example of the profound transformation that can happen in a person's life, no matter where they start from. I think here also in our current lifetime, Frankie Parker, who murdered 2 women and tried to murder the 9-year-old daughter of one of them unsuccessfully. He thought he had killed her, but as they were putting her body into the body bag, she came back to life. She stirred, and they realized that she wasn't actually dead. She was just profoundly traumatized and shut down. And for that, he was condemned to death. And he was on death row for many, many years. I don't remember what prison he was in, but at any rate, he was on death row, and he was considered a terrible prisoner and was constantly in isolation. And at one point, it seems, a guard, for whatever reason, tossed a copy of the Dhammapada, which is the earliest teachings of the Buddha, into his solitary cell, where he was being punished by being deprived of any contact with anything. And so he started reading it. And there's a pair of linked verses in there. There's actually quite a few. There's a whole chapter of linked verses. And the one that struck him was, and I can't recite it by memory, but basically the upshot of it is that whatever we think is going to manifest in behavior. So when we have a negative thought, we're going to find ourselves doing negative things. If we have a positive thoughts, then good things will come forth of that. And it completely transformed him. He became a model prisoner. He learned how to do Zazen. He taught other prisoners how to become model prisoners. Eventually, he was executed because his karma was too intense for not that to happen. In Angulimala's case, he became a monk. And of course, back then, people didn't live very long, maybe into their 40s or into their 30s. but certainly not to the life lengths that we live these days. We can transform. Now, here's another aspect to this. All of us come to practice through some level of concern, some level of discomfort. And for a number of those of us who practice, it comes out of a history of either trauma or what are known as adverse childhood experiences, where our parents were less than optimal parents. In fact, they were often not there or so wrapped up in their own lives that we were essentially abandoned, or whatever reason that there was a karmic antagonism. It's interesting that there was a study done many years ago. A woman was very interested in teaching young mothers, and I'm talking about young teenage mothers, 14, 15-year-old, 16-year-old mothers, how to be good mothers. And so she went in and got permission to videotape the interactions between the mothers and their kids. And this was over a period of time. I don't know how long, but she never got further than that because her funding was pulled. But eventually, many, many years later, she was able to get funding to do a follow-up study. By this time, these kids who were infants and toddlers when she first videotaped them were late teenagers, 18, 19, 20 years old. And it was very interesting because of the sequence of videos of the same mothers and children. You could see how the children were being affected by the incompetent mothering of this young teenage mother, probably gotten pregnant by accident, and was quite unable, probably through previous experience. Most likely those young girls had their own adverse childhood experiences when they were growing up. But at any rate, they were frustrated. They didn't understand how to relate to a child. And the result was the children were easily diagnosed with the results of adverse childhood experiences. In other words, with different, what are known as attachment styles. Attachment, not in the sense of Buddhist attachment, clinging, although there is some potential for that. But when an infant is born, their brain develops as a result of the interaction with caregivers. And if that interaction has been positive and honoring, the child grows up with what is known as a secure attachment style and sees the world in a positive way. If the mother or the caregiver is absent for whatever reason, or is not there for the child consistently, then the child learns to distrust whether anybody will be there for them. And that follows to a worldview as well, that people cannot be trusted because that's their initial experiences. And there are a couple other forms, but what they discovered, because none of these children had positive experiences, consistent positive experiences with their mothers or other caregivers. And they discovered that every single one of them, by their late teenagers, was involved in the juvenile justice system because of issues with criminal behavior, or they were in jail, or they were addicts. It makes a difference how we grow up. It is said that Hitler was abused as a child, and it's easy to get a sense that his behavior, how he expressed his rage as he grew up was a result of that. Most of us hopefully have not had that degree of pain and suffering in childhood. And if we have, it's important, as you've heard so many times, to work with a therapist to sort it out, to free yourself from it. But I need to emphasize that underlying whatever behavior still is a wondrous human being. The behavior, not so much, but the behavior is not the person. And because the behavior is not the person, it can be changed. And there are many, many examples of it. The story of Angulimala is the primary teaching example of it in Buddhism. But we've seen many examples of, or heard many examples of people being turned around by positive influence, and not people saying you should be this way, but by examples. One example is Mitra-roshi. Now, it wasn't anything to do with whether he had an unfortunate childhood, because he did not. His childhood was filled with laughter and being treasured by his parents. His siblings speak of that. And but he had no interest in becoming a Buddhist priest. He was raised in a temple. His father was a Buddhist priest, but he had no interest in that. At the same time, he wanted to become, when he finally got to college, he wanted to become a psychologist, because he thought that he could become a better person, work on his own stuff, if he became a psychologist. When he was a kid, he wanted to be a pilot, or I think that was the main thing. He wanted to actually fly rockets. But by the time he got to college age, he felt that he had parts of himself that he really did not like, and he wanted to change them. And so he was going to school, going to college, studying psychology, when a chance encounter on a bus, with no words exchanged between them, with Yamada Mumon-roshi, and the impact of Mumon-roshi's profound, deep, quiet, and peaceful demeanor turned young Harada to a life as a Buddhist monk and teacher. Now, that said, we all have stuff. It's rare that any of us are true 24-hour saints, although our potential is there, but we're conditioned by our culture, we're conditioned by our peers, and we have reactions to situations that we're not happy with. And so we develop habit patterns. And along with that, if we're brought up by parents who are prejudiced, we, despite the fact that we may be well aware of their prejudices and want nothing to do with being prejudiced, lo and behold, as we go deeper and deeper in our practice, we find ourselves actually emulating our parents. We just have not willingly seen it. We've hidden it from ourselves and projected it onto other people. This is classic. So as we go deeper in our practice, it's essential to allow ourselves to have the courage to see clearly where we are caught in dysfunctional habit patterns, and to see it deeply enough, feel it deeply enough, with enough remorse and regret that we just don't want to be like that. Superficially, we don't anyway. If somebody said, do you want to do this, that, or the other thing that is negative? We would say, of course not. And yet we find ourselves unwittingly behaving in the way we were conditioned. But we can change. Angulimala changed from being a horrid murderer, violent murderer, to becoming an example of peace and transformation. We can too. None of us, as far as I know, have a background as wretched as his. But I have seen things in my own life. I've seen my own behavior more clearly and recognized that it was not how I really would have wanted to behave. And recognize as well that as soon as I owned that behavior, there came the remorse and the regret that made me never want to do it again. And from then on, if the habit energy was still somewhat prevalent, and I would be finding myself starting to or about to start to indulge again in that negative behavior, it's almost as if this big red flashing sign would go up in front of me saying, do you really want to do this? And it was easy not to do it. It was easy not to do it. The hardest part is to recognize within ourselves. And when we take a look at what we think and how we behave in terms of our opinions of other people, that is a good indicator that if we're condemning somebody else for some kind of behavior, there's a good chance it's because we've indulged in it ourselves and we're not willing to own it. And so we're projecting it on somebody else. The wonderful side of this is that we can become free, truly, truly free. We can become this innately perfect human being that we are, that we're born as. As we let go the less harmonious behavior, and this is not about being Pollyanna or trying to make ourselves into some ideal that we think we ought to be, somebody especially kind and whatever. It doesn't work. We can't apply it from the top down. It has to come from awareness of our actual behavior and owning it and resolving not to indulge it again. It's very interesting that when a bunch of us moved to Santa Fe because it looked like we were going to build a country retreat place for the Rochester Zen Center, a place where Roshi Kapleau could go into semi-retirement with a few senior students and turn the Rochester Zen Center over to Tony Packer. But many karmic things interfered with that. It didn't happen. But 17 of us moved out to Santa Fe to make it happen, we hoped. And one couple got very involved in the peace movement in Santa Fe. And I remember them saying to me, it's just crazy. We're part of like 2 or 3 different groups of people trying to create peace in the world, and they can't agree among themselves. They're fighting about how to make peace. It has to come from within us. And the other side of that is that as we become less and less attached and more free of our stuff, including our dysfunctional behavior patterns, that sense of peace and equanimity radiates out and is felt by countless beings. Just as when Mitra-roshi got onto the bus that Harada was on that fateful morning in Kyoto, and it was so clear without any words. And young Harada was so surprised because Mitra-roshi was wearing monk's robes. And that wasn't his idea of what a monk would be. And it was so strong an impression that he changed his whole life. And you may also know other stories of this. A small bit of this is Jacques Lutheran, who, when he was in Buchenwald, and everyone was starving, and because he was blind, other prisoners would steal his bread. So all he had was maybe a little bit of thin soup to eat. And he was dying. And as you've heard many times, because it is a favorite story of mine, here again is the potential for human transformation. He was dying. And instead of dying, he went fully into the physical experience of the process, just as Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche did in the book, actually in his life, which he relates in the book In Love with the World, the travels in a monk's travels through the bardos of living and dying, in which he was dying himself, and he just stayed so present with the experience of it. In his case, he was rescued and found himself waking up in a hospital. Other people, Jacques Lutheran just survived, and he survived with a profound transformation. And after that, his energy was so positive, so peaceful, that nobody stole his bread after that. And instead, they would lead him to people who were freaking out because just his profoundly quiet, presence was able to calm them down. So to work on the long maturation is vital in terms of offering peace and tranquility into this suffering world. It's not just for our own sake, but we don't do practice just for our own sake in the Mahayana form of Buddhism. We do it for the liberation of all beings. And that liberation takes place gradually as we ourselves liberate ourselves through our clarity, our increasing clarity of mind, through our willingness to own our behavior and to rectify it. It's an incredible, miraculous practice. And each one of us has the potential to transform. And in that transformation, countless beings will be positively influenced. Not to mention the fact that our own life will be a little bit more pleasant. So when Torenji and Hakuin talked about the long maturation and the advanced practice, they were quite serious about the full extent of Zen practice. Zen practice is not just about sitting zazen, having a kensho, and thinking we're home free. It's about the opportunities for personal transformation that kensho offers. And particularly if we continue practicing more and more deeply and open to more clarity and wisdom. What an immense gift. This is our practice. It's an incredible gift. So I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.